She was humiliated, insulted, and even tried to be fired. But who would have thought that this unnecessary cleaner is the one who owns the company? Now those who laughed at her can say goodbye to their positions. True justice is at hand. Subscribe so you don't miss exciting stories of strength and justice. Write in the comments, what would you do if you were in her shoes? The boardroom buzzed with tension as Clara quietly moved across the floor, pushing her mop and bucket. Her movements were methodical, slow, deliberate even. But her mind was racing, observing every conversation, noting every facial expression, and memorizing the power dynamics in the room. She wasn't just any janitor, she was the woman who owned the building. They stood in the owner of the corporation. They worked for the silent observer, who had decided to temporarily bury her title as CEO to understand what was really going wrong in her new acquisition from a corner. She watched the men in their suits, many of whom were completely unaware of her presence. They were busy discussing a strategy to cut costs, debating which departments to lay off, and how best to position their inevitable decline as an unfortunate but necessary restructuring. None of them knew that their fates were being observed by the one person who truly had the power to make the final decision. Clara had bought this corporation a few months ago when it was on the brink of collapse. The company had been a powerhouse, once a leader in the tech industry, but had since crumbled under mismanagement, ego-driven leadership, and a lack of innovation. What struck her most when reviewing the files wasn't the financial figures or declining market share. It was the sheer disregard for the employees, the blatant neglect of the people who were the foundation of the company's success. Her decision to come in as a janitor wasn't made lightly. Clara had spent her life climbing from the bottom, born into a family with little means. She had seen firsthand how powerful people disregarded those they deemed unworthy. She built her business from the ground up, working endless hours, proving herself in rooms full of people who often saw only her skin color or gender. The lessons she learned in humility and perseverance were the very ones that brought her to this moment. It had been 2 weeks since she'd taken up the mop and bucket. Every day she was exposed to the same ugly truths. Casual racism, snide remarks, and dismissive attitudes. As soon as she stepped into the role of a janitor, she became invisible to the very people whose jobs she controlled. Clara knew the importance of understanding the real problems within her company, not just from the spreadsheets or executive reports, but from the workers themselves. She bent down, wiping a spot of coffee from the floor as the room's voices grew louder. "We can't keep paying for the benefits packages at this rate," said one of the senior executives, a tall man with a cold expression. His voice dripped with arrogance. "If we cut 20% of the lower level staff, we could save enough to keep the board satisfied for another quarter." Several people nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on the charts displayed on the wall. Clara's heart tightened. She had seen this strategy play out too many times before. Layoffs that hurt the most vulnerable, cuts that left the workforce depleted and disheartened. The company was being stripped from the inside out with no thought to the long-term impact of these decisions. One of the men, Mark Hastings, a mid-level manager with ambitions that far exceeded his abilities, turned to glance at Clara briefly before rolling his eyes. "These janitors," he muttered under his breath, barely audible to the others. "We could cut them too. I mean, they're barely necessary. I don't know why we even need so many of them." The comment stung, but Clara kept her face neutral, continuing to wipe down a nearby table. She'd endured worse in her life, but it still amazed her how easy it was for some people to dehumanize others when they thought no one of importance was listening. Clara wasn't here to react to petty insults. She had a mission. She needed to understand the rot in this company, and each day of pretending to be at the bottom of the ladder showed her how deeply it ran in the break room. Later that day, Clara sat alone at one of the small round tables, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. Around her, other employees gossiped, unaware of her presence, treating her like part of the furniture. One of the women, Jennifer, an administrative assistant, leaned against the counter, laughing with her co-workers. "Did you hear about that new janitor?" she asked, her voice loud enough to ensure Clara could hear. "She's so quiet, barely says a word. I bet she doesn't even speak English." A chorus of laughter followed. But Clara remained still, her expression unreadable. The comments were familiar, and she had learned long ago to let such things roll off her back. But it wasn't the insults that disturbed her, it was the complacency. No one questioned the casual racism. No one stood up for the janitor who, in their eyes, didn't deserve a second thought. It was in moments like these that Clara felt the weight of her decision to disguise herself. The disdain from those around her was palpable, but it also gave her invaluable insight. She now knew the corporate culture wasn't just flawed, it was toxic from the inside out. She would need to do more than restructure departments and adjust financial strategies. She would need to rebuild the company's moral foundation. Later that evening, as Clara finished her shift, she walked through the near-empty office halls. The building felt different. At night, quiet, almost peaceful, she lingered near the CEO's office, staring at the door with a brass nameplate that still bore the name of the previous owner. In a few weeks, that plate would carry her name, and when it did, she would bring a reckoning no one expected for now. Though she would continue to observe, to listen, to endure the humiliations and petty insults, she knew that when the time came, every single person who had treated her with disdain would see her for who she truly was, and in that moment, the balance of power would shift. Clara took a deep breath and turned away from the office, heading toward the exit. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the heavy tension that had built throughout the day. As she walked to her car, she couldn't help but think of the coming storm. They wouldn't see it coming. They never did, but she was ready. She had always been ready. The next day began just as the others had, with Clara donning her janitor's uniform and stepping into the office unnoticed. But this time she felt the weight of her mission more heavily than ever before. The disdain, the casual racism. It was all part of a system she would soon dismantle. For now, though, she had to endure, because true change didn't happen overnight. It required patience, and Clara had learned the art of patience long ago as she pushed him up, down. The all she knew that soon the same. People who dismissed her would be begging for her attention. The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of the corporate building as Clara once again assumed her role as an invisible part of the company's ecosystem. As she walked through the cars in her janitor's uniform, it was as if she had donned a cloak of invisibility to the employees bustling around her. She wasn't a person. They didn't see her as someone with thoughts, feelings, or opinions. She was just the janitor. That fact became all too clear day after day as her patience and endurance were tested in ways that would have broken lesser individuals. Today was no exception. As she pushed her cleaning cart into one of the conference rooms, a group of employees were already gathered, chatting animatedly about the upcoming layoffs. Clara moved to the far end of the room, sweeping the floor with deliberate slowness, hoping to stay unnoticed long enough to gather more of their unfiltered opinions. I heard they planning to cut another 15% of the workforce, one of the women said, her voice dripping with concern. It was Jennifer again, the same administrative assistant who had mocked Clara just a day before. I bet half of these janitors will be out the door soon. Can you imagine? They're barely necessary as it is. The casual disdain in her voice was all too familiar to Clara. It was the same tone she had encountered throughout her career from people who believed that one's worth could be measured by their job title. She remained silent, focusing on her work, as they continued their conversation, laughing as they speculated on who would be the next to go. Mark Hastings, the Ambity IU's mid-level manager, who had scoffed at the idea of janitors the day before, chimed in. Honestly, I don't know why we need so many of them. They walk around like they're important, but I've never seen them do anything that justifies having more than one or two in the whole building. Clara gritted her teeth but kept her expression neutral. She knew how easy it was for people like Mark to make snap judgments about others without a second thought. They were so consumed by their own ambition and sense of superiority that they couldn't see the value in anyone who didn't fit their narrow view of success. As the day progressed, Clara's interactions with her coworkers only grew more demeaning. In the break room, she sat alone at one of the tables as usual, sipping her coffee from the same chipped mug. The room was filled with idle chatter, As other employees gathered in small groups laughing and discussing their weekend plans, Clara had learned to tune out their conversations, but today the words cut a little deeper. One of the men, a young intern named Tim, was standing by the coffee machine talking loudly with his friends. "I don't get why they keep so many janitors around. I mean, how hard can it be to clean a building? They just push brooms and wipe down desks, right? My grandmother could do that job." Laughter erupted around him, and Clara felt her hands tighten around the handle of her mug she had long since learned to endure. Comments like these to let them roll off her back without showing any outward reaction. But inside she felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a stereotype, of being judged solely by the uniform she wore. Tim turned to look at Clara briefly, his eyes flicking over her as if she were part of the furniture. "I mean, look at her, doesn't even talk to anyone, probably doesn't speak English." More laughter followed, and Clara kept her gaze firmly on her coffee, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a response. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the anger bubbling beneath the surface, but she swallowed it down. These people had no idea who she was or what she was capable of. They didn't know that the woman they were mocking was the very person who would soon hold their professional lives in her hands. The afternoon brought more of the same as Clara made her way through the office, performing her usual tasks. The condescension was almost unbearable. Mark Hastings, still as dismissive as ever, called her over, while he sat at his desk staring at his computer screen. "Hey you," he said, not even been bothering to look up as he waved her toward him. "The trash can is overflowing. Why don't you take care of that?" Clara walked over calmly, her expression blank. She glanced at the trash can. It wasn't even half full. She could feel the eyes of the other employees on her as Mark continued to scroll through his emails, ignoring her presence with a practiced ease. She took the bag out of the can, tied it up, and replaced it with a new one. She said nothing, but the silence between them was deafening. As she turned to leave, she overheard Mark muttering to a colleague, "I swear these people are so slow, no sense of urgency. They probably think they deserve a raise just for showing up." The words echoed in Clara's mind. As she walked away, she had heard it all before: dismissal, dehumanization, the casual racism that seeped into the very fabric of the workplace. It was an all too familiar refrain in her life, one she had been forced to endure since she was a child. But Clara knew something that Mark and the others didn't. Endurance wasn't weakness. It was strength. Later that evening, after most of the employees had left for the day, Clara found herself alone in the office. She stood in front of the CEO's office, the door still bearing the name of the previous owner. In a few short weeks, that name would be replaced by hers, and the very people who had treated her like an afterthought would come to understand the weight of their actions. But for now, she was still the janitor, still invisible, and that was exactly what she needed to be. As she walked through the empty halls, she thought about the lessons she had learned over the years, about patience, perseverance, and the power of silence. The people around her had no idea who she was, and that gave her an advantage. They couldn't comprehend Clara had endured worse in her life. The insults and the casual racism were nothing new to her. What mattered was the end game. And Clara had always been a master strategist. She pushed her cart toward the exit, the night air cool against her skin as she stepped outside. The quiet of the evening was a welcome contrast to the noise of the day, and as she made her way to her car, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. In just a few weeks, the power dynamics would shift. The people who had mocked her would soon find themselves at her mercy, and Clara would have the opportunity to enact the change this company so desperately needed. But change took time, and for now she had to continue playing her role. The next day, the tension in the office was palpable. Rumors of layoffs were spreading like wildfire, and the employees were on edge. Unsure of what the future held, Clara knew that the time for action was drawing near. She had gathered enough information, endured enough humiliation, and now it was time to take the next step. As she entered the office, her mind was focused on the upcoming board meeting. The executives would be discussing the company's future, and Clara knew that their decisions would only make things worse, but this time she wouldn't stand by and watch. This time, she would make her voice heard. The storm was coming and Clara was ready. The morning dawned gray, casting an ominous light through the glass windows of the office building. The usual buzz in the corporate halls was more subdued then. Ever filled with murmurs of anxiety and speculation, Clara, dressed in her janitor's uniform, moved through the building as she had every day for weeks. But today felt different. There was a sense of impending doom in the air, a tension that rippled through every interaction, every conversation. Rumors of layoffs had spread like wildfire, and the whispers of impending disaster grew louder with each passing hour. Today everything would change. Claire knew that this day would mark a turning point, not just for the company but for herself as well. The upcoming board meeting would determine the corporation's future, and the executives would once again gather to make decisions that would affect hundreds of lives. They would discuss layoffs, budget cuts, and the possibility of closing entire departments. Clara had seen this scenario play out before, executives trying to salvage their own positions while sacrificing the job of those they deemed expendable. As she pushed her cleaning cart down the hall, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and resolve. She had endured the snide remarks, the condescension, the casual racism, all for this moment. It wasn't just about saving the company. It was about proving something to herself, to the employees, and to the world. She had observed the decay from the inside out, and now it was time to act. The boardroom, filled with sleek leather chairs and a long glass table, was already occupied when Clara entered to begin cleaning. The meeting was still an hour away, but the executives had gathered early, huddling in small groups, discussing the impending crisis. In hushed tones, Clara recognized most of them by now. The same faces that had dismissed her as unimportant, irrelevant, nothing more than a fixture in the room. Mark Hastings, as usual, was front and center, his loud voice carrying across the room. He was in the middle of what seemed to be an impromptu pep talk with some of the other senior managers, though his tone was more self-congratulatory than inspiring. "We're going to have to make some tough decisions today," he said, crossing his arms with a self-assured smirk, "but it's for the good of the company. We can't keep all these unnecessary people on the payroll. It's time to trim the fat." Several others nodded in agreement, and Clara couldn't help but feel a surge of anger as she wiped down the conference table. Unnecessary people. That's what they called their employees, as if they were disposable, as if their livelihoods didn't matter. She had seen the looks of fear and uncertainty on the faces of the lower-level workers, the same people who would bear the brunt of the decisions being made in this room. Hastings, oblivious to her presence as always, continued. "The janitorial staff alone could be reduced by half. We don't need so many people to keep the place clean. Hell, I bet we could outsource the entire department and save a fortune." Clara kept her eyes on the table, biting her tongue. She had heard enough over the past few weeks to understand the true nature of these people, how easily they dehumanized others, reducing them to numbers on a spreadsheet, statistics in a financial report. But today she wouldn't stay silent. The hour passed quickly, and soon the room filled with the rest of the executives, all of them taking their seats around the table as the meeting was called to order. Clara moved to the corner of the room, blending into the background as the janitor, her presence unnoticed by the powerful men and women who would soon decide the fates of their employees. The CEO, a man named Richard Owens, stood at the head of the table, his expression grim. "We're in trouble," he began without preamble. "Our projections for the next quarter are worse than anticipated. If we don't take immediate action, we're looking at a total collapse. We need to cut costs across the board, and that means layoffs, deep layoffs." Clara listened carefully as the conversation unfolded, each executive presenting their own version of the same flawed solution they talked about. Slashing jobs, closing entire departments, reducing benefits. Not once did anyone mention innovation, growth, or investment in the people who made the company run. It was all about cutting corners, saving their own skins, while ignoring the long-term consequences. I propose we start with the administrative staff, one of the executives said. Glancing at the stack of papers in front of him, we could reduce their numbers by at least 25%. That should give us enough breathing room for the next quarter. And the janitor staff, Mark Hastings added quickly. We could outsource that entirely. There's no need to keep them on payroll when we can get a third-party company to do the same work for half the cost. Clara's grip tightened on the handle of her mop. She had heard enough, she knew. Now that if she didn't act, the company would spiral into a disaster that could have been prevented. The decisions being made today weren't about saving the company. They were about saving the jobs of the executives at the expense of everyone else. For weeks she had kept her identity hidden, observing, learning, and understanding the full scope of the problem. But now it was time to reveal the truth. Clara was ready to take control. But she needed to do it strategically, not out of emotion. As the executives continued their discussion, Clara quietly set her mop aside and walked to the head of the table where Richard Owens stood. She tapped him lightly on the shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to drop the facade she had maintained for so long. Excuse me, she said, her voice steady but firm. Owens turned to her, startled by the interruption, his brows furrowed in confusion as he looked at her, not recognizing the woman standing before him. Yes, what is it? Clara met his gaze without flinching. I think it's time I spoke. The room fell silent. All eyes suddenly on her. The executives exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what to make of the janitor. Standing at the head of their table, Mark Hastings, ever the opportunist, was the first to break the silence. What are you doing? He asked, his voice dripping with condescension. This is a private meeting. You have no business here. Clara didn't react to his tone. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope, the very envelope that contained the documentation of her ownership of the company. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see how far they would go before she revealed the truth. I think you'll find that I have every right to be here, she said calmly, handing the envelope to Richard Owens. And as of today, I will be making the decisions that determine this company's future. Owens stared at the envelope in disbelief before tearing it open and scanning the documents inside. His face went pale as he read the words confirming Clara as the majority owner of the corporation. He looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. This can't be right. Oh, it's very right, Clara replied, her voice steady as she addressed the room. I've owned this company for weeks now, and I've been watching, listening, and learning everything about how it's been run. And I've heard enough to know that the decisions you're making will destroy it. The room erupted into chaos. Executives spoke over one another, trying to make sense of what was happening. Mark Hastings was the loudest, his face red with anger as he stood up from his chair. You can't do this, you're just a janitor. Clara turned to him, her gaze cold and unyielding. I'm not just anything, I'm the woman who now controls your job, your salary, and the future of this company. And I'll be making sure that people like you, people who think they can walk all over others without consequence, are held accountable. The room fell silent once again as the weight of her words settled. And Clara looked around at the faces of the executives who had dismissed her for weeks, the same people who had mocked her, ignored her, and dehumanized her. She had endured their arrogance, their racism, and their ignorance. And now she stood before them as their boss. The fallout from Clara's revelation was swift and severe. As she took her seat at the head of the table, the power dynamic in the room shifted completely. The executives who had once held all the control were now scrambling to protect their positions, but Clara wasn't interested in preserving the old ways. She was here to dismantle the rot that had taken root in the company and rebuild it from the ground up. Her first order of business was simple: to ensure that those who had perpetuated the toxic culture were no longer part of it. Mark Hastings and others like him would soon find themselves out of a job, and Clara would Begin the process of transforming the company into a place where every employee, regardless of their role, was treated with respect and dignity. The boardroom sat in stunned silence, the air thick with tension, as the weight of Clara's revelation settled in her eyes scanned the room meeting. Each pair of stunned, disbelieving eyes with a calm, unwavering gaze. She could see the shock in their faces, the disbelief that the woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a janitor now held their fates in her hands. For weeks, they had treated her with disdain, never imagining that she was the true power behind the company, and now their worlds were about to collapse. Clara let the silence linger for a moment longer. Savoring the shift in power, the very people who had mocked and belittled her were now at her mercy, and they knew it. The air crackled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and anger, but no one dared speak. Not yet. Mark Hastings, his face still flushed from the outburst moments earlier, was the first to break the silence. He shot up from his chair, fists clenched, eyes blazing with fury. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're just a janitor. You can't come in here and act like you own the place." Clara turned to him slowly, her expression calm, her voice steady as steel. "But I do own the place, Mark. I've owned it for weeks, long before you ever realized I was here. And during that time, I've seen exactly how you and others like you treat the people who make this company run." Hastings' face twisted in anger, but there was something else behind it now. Fear. He knew what was coming, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. Clara took a step toward him, her voice quiet but firm. "For weeks I watched you belittle and demean the people who work here. You called them unnecessary. You said they didn't matter. Well, now you're going to learn what it feels like to be the one who doesn't matter." Hastings opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say another word, Clara raised her hand to silence him. "You're fired," she said coldly, her eyes locking onto his effective. "Immediately. Security will escort you out of the building." A wave of gasps swept through the room. Hastings' face drained of color as the reality of her words hit him. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice now tinged with panic. "I've been with this company for years. I know how things work here." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "And that's precisely why you're being let go. You've been here too long, Mark, long enough to think you're untouchable, but you're not. No one is." Before Hastings could respond, 2 security guards entered the room, standing by the door. As Clara gave them a small nod, "Escort Mr. Hastings out of the building," she instructed, her tone firm. The guards moved toward Hastings, who looked around the room for support. But no one came to his defense. They were all too shocked, too fearful of losing their own positions. Hastings muttered under his breath as the guards led him out, but his protests were weak, his confidence shattered as the door closed. Behind him, the room remained silent, the tension palpable. Clara turned back to the rest of the executives, her expression unreadable now. She said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "Let's talk about the future of this company." Rich Owens, still seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly rattled by the sudden turn of events. "Miss Sanders," he began cautiously, "if I may, what exactly are your intentions here? I think we're all a bit unclear about the direction you plan to take." Clara nodded slowly, her gaze sweeping the room as she spoke. "My intentions are simple. This company has been in free fall for months, and the decisions you've been making are leading it toward collapse. I bought this corporation to save it, but I can't do that if the same toxic leadership remains in place." Her words hung in the air, the implication clear. She wasn't just here to replace a few people. She was here to overhaul the entire culture. For too long, this company has been run by people who think they can treat others like they're disposable. Clara continued, "You talk about cutting jobs and outsourcing departments like it's nothing, but you've forgotten that behind every number is a person. You've forgotten that the success of this company depends on the people who work here, not just the executives, but the janitors, the administrative staff, the workers on the ground. Her words were measured, controlled, but the passion behind them was undeniable. She had spent her entire career fighting against the kind of elitism and arrogance that she had witnessed in this company, and now she had the power to do something about it. The way this company has been run is unacceptable, Clara said, her voice firm. And starting today, that changes. For the next hour, Clara laid out her vision for the future of the company. She explained her plans for restructuring, not through layoffs and budget cuts, but by investing in the employees who had been overlooked for so long. She spoke of innovation, growth, and long-term sustainability concepts that had been sorely lacking in the discussions led by the former executives. Some of the executives listened in silence, still trying to process the dramatic shift in leadership. Others, clearly fearful of losing their positions, nodded along, eager to show their support for the new direction. But Clara wasn't interested in sick ant. She wanted real change, and she knew that meant getting rid of the dead weight at the top. By the time the meeting was over, several more executives had been quietly dismissed, their severance packages already prepared. Clara had no patience for those who couldn't adapt to her vision, and she made it clear that anyone who wasn't willing to embrace the new direction would be shown the door. Later that evening, after most of the executives had left the building, Clara walked through the now empty halls. The office felt different now, quieter, almost peaceful. She knew that the changes she had implemented today were just the beginning. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of accomplishment as she passed the office, where her name would soon be engraved on the door. She paused for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had endured weeks of humiliation and disrespect, but it had all been worth it. She had seen the true nature of the people who had once held power in this company, and now they were gone. But more importantly, Clara had proven something to herself. She had always known she had the strength to succeed, but now she had the power to change the lives of the people who worked for her. She had the opportunity to create a company where everyone was valued, where no one was treated as disposable. As she stood in the quiet hallway, she allowed herself a small smile. The storm had come and gone, and Clara had emerged victorious. A week later, the company was buzzing with renewed energy. Word had spread quickly about the changes Clara had implemented, and the employees, those who had feared for their jobs, were now cautiously optimistic about the future. The toxic culture that had once pervaded the office was being dismantled piece by piece, and in its place something new was growing. Clara sat in her new office. The view of the city skyline stretching out before her. On her desk was a stack of files, each one representing a new opportunity, a new direction for the company. She had always believed that leadership wasn't about titles or power. It was